Welcome, dear listener. Imagine yourself standing on the edge of a ship, the salt of the sea in the air, the horizon stretching endlessly before you. The wind tugs at your clothes, and the rhythmic creak of wood and sway of the sea beckon you into a world far from the comforts of modern life. Tonight, we embark on a journey not into the romanticized version of pirates that we often see in books and films, but into the true life of pirates, their daily struggles, their harsh conditions, and the constant dangers they faced. Pirates have long captured our imaginations with their treasure hunts, daring raids, and swashbuckling adventures. But beneath the myth and legend lies a much darker reality. The pirate life was not one of luxury and endless excitement, but a grueling existence where survival itself was a constant struggle. The pirate ships that seemed so thrilling on the silver screen were, in fact, cramped, damp, and perilous. And the so-called pirate code often gave little protection from the very people they sailed with. Tonight, as we drift through the stories of those who sailed the high seas in the golden age of piracy, we will peel back the layers of myth and uncover what it was really like to live and often die by the sword, the wind, and the unforgiving ocean. We will take a closer look at the pirates who roamed the seas, the legends that arose around them, and the harsh truths that they would never share in the songs sung about their adventures. So settle in, let your mind wander, and imagine what it was like to live a life where danger and hardship were constants, and even the fleeting moments of calm could not guarantee safety or peace. Picture yourself aboard a pirate ship. The wooden planks beneath your feet are slick with sea spray, and the air smells of salt water and sweat. There's a constant creaking of the ship's timbers, a noise that seems to echo through your bones, warning you of the fragile nature of the vessel you call home. The sky above is often a dull grey, with clouds hanging heavy and low, as if they too are weighed down by the hardships that you face. Life on a pirate ship in the golden age of piracy was not an easy one. Far from the glamorous image of pirates lounging in taverns with rum in hand, the reality was a life filled with discomfort, danger, and constant struggle. The first thing you would notice, if you could imagine yourself standing on the ship's deck, is the relentless motion of the sea. Waves toss the ship from side to side, and the sway of the boat becomes a constant companion. In calm weather, the motion is gentle, but when the winds pick up, the ship becomes an unpredictable beast. You learn to keep your balance or risk being thrown overboard. The sun is merciless, baking your skin during the day, while the nights are long and cold, offering little respite. But it wasn't just the weather that made life difficult for pirates. The ship itself, while an essential tool of their trade, was often cramped and uncomfortable. The lower decks of pirate ships were dark and damp, filled with the smell of mold and unwashed bodies. Space was scarce. The crew had to make do with small quarters, often sleeping on the floor or in tight hammocks that swayed with the ship. The conditions were far from the romanticized pirate havens we imagine today. In fact, it wasn't uncommon for sailors to suffer from diseases such as scurvy, which was caused by a lack of fresh fruit and vegetables, and could leave pirates weak, exhausted, and in constant pain. Without the modern knowledge of nutrition, many died from simple illnesses that would seem trivial by today's standards. And then, of course, there was the ever-present danger. The pirate code, while offering a semblance of order, didn't protect anyone from the constant threat of death. You were always at risk, whether from enemy ships, rival pirate crews, or even the sea itself. One of the greatest threats pirates faced was the naval powers of the time forces like the British Royal Navy, whose ships were far better equipped and more disciplined. These sailors were well-trained and organized, unlike the often disjointed pirate crews, who were held together by little more than a shared desire for plunder. While pirates would sometimes attack ships, their own vessels were often poorly maintained and barely afloat. Repairs were done quickly and without the luxury of time or resources. A single bad storm could send a pirate ship to the bottom of the sea, taking with it the pirates' wealth, their crew, and sometimes their lives. The pirate life was one of constant motion, constantly searching for the next ship to plunder, the next opportunity for survival. But even when they did capture a ship, life on board was far from the thrill we might imagine. Loot was often meagre, and there was never enough food or water to go around. If a pirate captain was too harsh, the crew could mutiny. If a captain was too lenient, they might lose their authority. The balance was always delicate, and the pirate life was one where a misstep could cost you everything. And yet, despite the hardship, the pirates carried on. They had no other choice. The promise of treasure and freedom on the high seas was often too enticing to give up, even if it meant living in constant danger and discomfort. To survive, they had to be ruthless. They had to be willing to do whatever it took to stay alive, to take on the sea's challenges, and to fight for their place in the world. As we leave behind the harsh realities of pirate life, imagine yourself now, shifting from the creaking wooden decks to the darker, quieter world of a single pirate whose life rose and fell in the brutal embrace of the sea. Blackbeard, a name that became synonymous with terror on the high seas. Now that we have explored the harsh realities of being a pirate, let us focus on one of the most infamous figures of the golden age of piracy, Blackbeard, whose name alone evokes a sense of dread and fascination. However, beyond the myth, there is a story of ambition, struggle, and a life lived on the edge of destruction. Imagine, for a moment, the figure of Edward Teach, better known as Blackbeard, standing at the helm of his ship, Queen Anne's Revenge. The towering pirate captain, with his long, thick, bearded black, of course was a menacing sight to any who crossed his path. He wore slow-burning fuses in his beard and hair, creating an image of fire and smoke, an aura of impending doom. His ship, a former slave ship turned pirate vessel, was armed with 40 guns and crewed by a ruthless band of pirates. But before he became the terror of the high seas, Blackbeard was simply a man born somewhere around 1690, possibly in Bristol, England. He began his seafaring career like many others of the time, working on merchant ships or as a privateer, taking part in raids under a legal commission granted by the British government during wartime. But as the wars ended, many former privateers, without any steady income, turned to piracy. It was during this time that Blackbeard's name began to grow in infamy. His rise to power, however, was not without hardship. Like all pirates, Blackbeard had to contend with the dangers of the sea, from hostile nations and enemy ships to the internal strife of pirate crews. Pirate life, as we've discussed, was brutal, and Blackbeard was no exception. As his reputation grew, so did the risks he faced. Yet, his leadership was magnetic. He demanded loyalty, but he also knew how to keep his crew in check with the promise of gold, power, and freedom on the high seas. Blackbeard's flagship, Queen Anne's Revenge, was a symbol of his power. It was a ship that struck fear into the hearts of sailors across the Caribbean. It was heavily armed and dangerous, but it was also a symbol of the uncertainty of life on the high seas. Even with such a powerful vessel, Blackbeard and his crew were constantly battling hunger, disease, and the risk of mutiny. The pirate crews, like his, were often made up of desperate men from all walks of life: sailors, escaped slaves, soldiers, and even the disenfranchised. They formed a loose bond of survival, bound not by honor but by necessity. As a leader, Blackbeard maintained a brutal authority over his crew. His pirate code was strict and unforgiving. However, unlike some pirate captains, Blackbeard often avoided unnecessary violence, preferring to intimidate his enemies into surrender. He would sail into harbors and simply block the entrance, waiting for merchant ships to come to him. His ship's fearsome appearance, with the thick smoke billowing from his beard and the cannons trained on unsuspecting ships, was often enough to bring cargo vessels to their knees without a fight. But life as a pirate king came with its own set of problems. Blackbeard's ruthless reputation brought him enemies not just on the seas, but from within his own ranks. Pirate crews were notorious for being discontented, and Blackbeard's leadership was always at risk of being challenged. In fact, his life was one of constant battle not just against enemies on the sea, but against the dangers of his own crew's potential mutiny and the relentless pursuit of naval forces. Blackbeard's final days were marked by his struggle to maintain control. In 1718, his reign came to an end in a bloody confrontation with Lieutenant Robert Maynard of the British Navy. Maynard had been sent to eliminate Blackbeard once and for all, and the two forces met off the coast of North Carolina. The battle was fierce, and Blackbeard's fate was sealed. Despite receiving multiple gunshot wounds and cuts, Blackbeard fought until the very end, refusing to surrender, even as his life slowly drained from him. His body was found floating in the water, a grim reminder of the price of power on the high seas. Blackbeard's death marked the end of an era. His story, like the stories of so many pirates, was filled with ambition, violence, and survival, but also with a harsh reality. He did not die in a blaze of glory, as some might imagine, but in a brutal, final struggle to hold on to the life he had fought so hard to build. The legend of Blackbeard endures, but the truth behind his life is one of constant battle against the sea, his enemies, and even his own mortality. As we leave behind the figure of Blackbeard, his story serves as a reminder of the fragility of life on the pirate ships and the relentless pursuit of freedom on the high seas. The pirates, for all their bravado, were always at the mercy of the sea, and sometimes even their greatest legends could not protect them from the inevitable end. Now, we turn our attention to the myths and legends that have surrounded pirates for centuries. What is the truth behind these tales? Were the treasures as bountiful as we are told? Or is the story of pirates merely a romanticized version of the real, gritty existence of life on the seas? As we leave the turbulent life of Blackbeard behind, we now find ourselves turning to the legends and myths that have grown around pirates over the centuries. Stories of buried treasure, treasure maps, and pirate codes have shaped much of what we believe about pirate life. But how much of it is actually true? Are these tales a reflection of the real pirate experience, or have they been exaggerated over time, altered to fit the needs of storytellers and historians alike? Imagine, if you will, the image of a pirate with their treasure chest overflowing with gold coins, jewels, and silver. The treasure map, marked with an X to show the buried loot, is one of the most enduring symbols of pirate lore. We have all seen the imager, rugged pirate with a patch over one eye, an unkempt beard, and a map in their hand, leading them toward unimaginable riches. But the reality was much more complicated, and often far less glamorous. First, let us consider the idea of pirate treasure. It's true that pirates did steal goods, but they rarely hoarded treasure in the way we are led to believe. Pirate crews often plundered merchant ships, taking anything of value cargo, money, or goods that could be traded. The idea that pirates would bury their treasure on a distant island is largely a myth. In reality, pirates were more concerned with spending their loot or trading it for supplies to continue their operations. Pirate ships didn't have the luxury of carrying large amounts of treasure, and the process of hiding it would have been both impractical and dangerous. After all, hiding treasure meant returning to the spot later to retrieve it, a risky proposition for a crew that constantly had to stay on the move to avoid capture. The legend of buried treasure is largely a product of popular fiction. Writers such as Robert Louis Stevenson, with his novel Treasure Island, have cemented this idea in the public imagination. But in the real world, pirates did not bury their loot on remote islands and draw elaborate maps to guide future generations to it. In fact, most pirates had little interest in hoarding treasure for later. For them, The goal was always survival, and survival meant spending what they stole to keep their ships afloat and their crews fed. Another myth we must address is the so-called pirate code. The pirate code has been romanticized and idealized, often depicted as a strict set of rules that pirates followed in their operations. Pirate movies and books frequently present a version of the code that dictates fair shares of loot, democratic decision-making, and even honorable conduct during raids. The reality, however, was far messier. While it is true that many pirate crews had some form of an agreement known as a pirate code, these codes were often less about morality and more about maintaining order within the chaotic and dangerous environment of piracy. The codes varied from ship to ship, and they were subject to constant change depending on the whims of the captain or the needs of the crew. The pirate code was more about ensuring the survival of the crew-keeping discipline in the face of danger, dividing spoils of war, and maintaining a balance of power between the crew and their captain. One of the most well-known rules of the pirate code was that a pirate's share of the loot was often proportional to their rank or role within the crew. Captains, for example, typically received a larger share, while regular crew members received a smaller portion. However, the captain's authority was not absolute. If a captain made a poor decision or failed to provide for the well-being of the crew, they could easily be voted out of power and replaced by another pirate. In this sense, the pirate code was a way to ensure that no one person could completely dominate the crew, but it was far from the noble set of rules we often imagine. Furthermore, the idea of pirates as champions of freedom and democracy is often romanticized. While it is true that some pirate crews operated with a relatively egalitarian structure, this was not because pirates were inherently egalitarian or democratic. Rather, it was a practical solution to the harsh and often dangerous life they led. Pirates lived on the edge of society, and their existence was one of constant danger and uncertainty. Having a code, and allowing crew members to have a say in decision-making, helped maintain stability and loyalty within the crew, but it was far from a utopian or idealistic form of government. As we move forward, we must also address the myth of the pirate king and the glorification of piracy in general. Pirates were often portrayed as rebellious heroes in popular stories, but the truth is that their lives were often filled with constant danger and hardship. Pirates weren't gallant adventurers, they were criminals, thieves, and desperate individuals who turned to piracy as a last resort for survival. Many pirates started their careers as sailors or soldiers, only to turn to piracy when their opportunities ran out. Life on the pirate ship was harsh, and many of the legendary figures we associate with piracy were not necessarily living the glamorous life we envision. This contrast between the romanticized version of piracy and the gritty reality is one of the key elements that makes pirate myths so captivating. Pirates were in many ways the embodiment of rebellion and freedom, yet their lives were anything but free. They were constantly at the mercy of the sea, the weather, and the threat of naval forces. Their survival was a precarious balancing act, and the myth of pirate treasure and adventure often overshadows the true, difficult, and often short lives that most pirates led. Now, let us take a moment to consider another element of pirate lore, the image of the pirate ship. Often portrayed as large, towering vessels with sails billowing in the wind, these ships are an iconic part of the pirate mythos. In reality, pirate ships were often not the grandiose vessels depicted in stories. They were usually smaller, faster ships that could be maneuvered quickly to outrun naval ships or capture unsuspecting merchant vessels. These ships were built for speed and agility, not for grandeur or luxury. Pirate ships, while formidable in their own right, were also fragile and prone to damage. Pirates didn't have the resources to maintain their ships in the same way as naval fleets, and many pirate vessels were in poor condition. Life on these ships was cramped and uncomfortable, and the constant battle against the elements took its toll. But despite the hardships, pirates continued to sail on, driven by the promise of wealth and the freedom of the open sea. As we leave behind the myths of pirates and treasure, let us now turn our attention to another aspect of piracy that is often overlooked: the struggles faced by the pirate elite. While common pirates endured hardship and uncertainty, the pirate captains and their crews lived a different kind of life, but even they faced their own unique set of challenges. While we've spent considerable time focusing on the hardships faced by the common pirate, it's time to shift our attention to a different facet of pirate society: the elite pirates, the captains and their trusted lieutenants. These pirates, although living with a measure of luxury and power, were not exempt from the dangers of the pirate life. In fact, the higher the rank, the more precarious their position often became. The pirate elite lived a life of contradictions. On one hand, they enjoyed wealth and power, while on the other, they were constantly beset by rivalries, mutiny, and the pressures of maintaining control over their ships and crews. Imagine, if you will, a pirate captain standing on the deck of a ship, surveying the horizon. The wind blows through their hair, their eyes scanning for any signs of enemy ships or potential treasure. They wear a fine coat, perhaps with gold trimmings, and carry a finely crafted sword at their side, symbols of their status. These men and women were the leaders of pirate crews, commanding loyalty from their subordinates and often striking fear into the hearts of those who encountered them. Their wealth was considerable, often measured in plundered goods and bounties, yet their lives were far from secure. The first challenge faced by the pirate elite was the constant need to maintain control over their crew. Pirate crews, unlike the disciplined ranks of naval forces, were a volatile group. Pirates were individuals, often with a disdain for authority, and their loyalty was never guaranteed. The pirate captain had to balance the need for control with the desire to keep the crew happy. If the captain was too harsh, they risked a mutiny. If they were too lenient, they risked losing the respect of their men. Pirate crews were known for their ruthless behavior, and many pirate captains found themselves fighting for their position, both against rival pirates and against their own crew members. A pirate captain's life was also one of constant danger. While the common pirate faced threats from naval forces and rival pirates, the captain's position was even more perilous. As the leader of the crew, the captain was often the first target in a mutiny. If things went poorly, the crew could easily overthrow the captain and replace them with someone they deemed more capable or more trustworthy. The threat of mutiny was always present, and pirate captains had to be constantly vigilant, watching for any signs of dissent among their crew. Even the most powerful pirate captains, like Blackbeard, were not immune to this threat. Blackbeard's own downfall came as a result of a naval officer's successful campaign against him, but also the instability within his own crew. The captain's role was one of leadership, but that leadership could be fragile, and the line between power and death was razor thin. But it wasn't just internal threats that plagued the pirate elite. External dangers were just as prevalent. The pirate world was a dangerous and chaotic place, and pirate captains had to constantly defend their territory, their ship, and their wealth from both the authorities and rival pirates. The British Navy, Spanish Armada, and other national naval forces were always hunting down pirates, seeking to put an end to their reign on the seas. The pirate captain had to stay one step ahead, always navigating a dangerous game of cat and mouse, constantly shifting locations to avoid detection. Despite these challenges, the pirate elite were often able to enjoy a degree of luxury that the common pirate could never experience. Pirate ships, while lacking the grandeur of naval warships, were still equipped with fine furnishings, and the captain's quarters were often the most comfortable on board. Pirate captains were able to dine on better food, sleep in more comfortable beds, and enjoy the spoils of their plunder. They often had access to fine wines, luxury items, and treasure that was beyond the reach of the average pirate. However, this wealth came at a cost. Pirate captains, despite their riches, were always at risk. They lived with the constant threat of violence, either from their own crew or from the forces of law and order. They had to make decisions that balanced the survival of the crew with the acquisition of more treasure. For the pirate captain, there was no retirement or peaceful life after piracy. Even the wealthiest pirate was always just one battle, one betrayal, or one wrong decision away from losing everything. One of the more tragic aspects of the pirate elite's lifestyle was the constant fear of being betrayed. Pirate crews were filled with men who had nothing to lose, and this made loyalty an elusive thing. Pirate captains could trust their crew only so far, and often, the very people they fought beside were the same ones who might one day turn against them. As a result, many pirate captains led lives filled with paranoia, constantly wary of being betrayed by those closest to them. In many ways, the pirate elite lived a double life. On the one hand, they were leaders, enjoying the riches of piracy and commanding respect from their crew. On the other hand, they were always in danger, living with the knowledge that their leadership could end at any moment, either from a mutiny or the relentless pursuit of the naval forces that sought to destroy them. Their wealth was not a guarantee of safety, but a reminder of how fleeting power could be in the world of piracy. As we reflect on the lives of these elite pirates, we see a pattern emerge: life filled with luxury and danger, power and paranoia, wealth and constant threat. They were the pirates who commanded respect and struck fear into the hearts of their enemies, but they also lived with the reality that their status could vanish in an instant. Their lives were a delicate balance of survival, ambition, and the relentless pursuit of more wealth. And in the end, even the most powerful pirate captain could not escape the harsh realities of life on the high seas. Imagine waking up on a pirate ship to the sound of the ocean crashing against the hull, the creaking of wood as the ship sways beneath you. The air is thick with the salty sting of the sea, and the ship smells of damp wood, sweat, and the remnants of a hard day's labor. You sleep in a cramped, shared space below deck, where the air is stale and musty. There's little room to stretch out, and personal privacy is a distant dream. You share this confined space with a dozen or more men, each one doing their best to avoid the constant discomfort of life at sea. The daily tasks are grueling. The ship must be maintained, sails must be repaired, and the deck must be scrubbed clean. There are no breaks from this relentless routine. You may spend hours on watch, staring out over the horizon, always alert for enemy ships or a possible raid. Meals are meager, often consisting of salted meat or hardtack, and fresh water is a rare luxury. Scurvy is a constant threat due to the lack of fresh fruits and vegetables. The days blend into one another as the constant rhythm of the sea and the ship's creaks become the only measure of time. The life of a pirate aboard the ship was often harsh, even for the most famous pirates. Take the case of Captain Blackbeard, whose ship Queen Anne's Revenge became one of the most feared pirate vessels of its time. Despite its notoriety, the Queen Anne's Revenge was not a luxurious home, but a vessel built for combat and raiding. The crew aboard Blackbeard's ship lived under constant pressure, facing the challenges of maintaining the ship, dealing with disease, and surviving constant battle. Blackbeard's ship had a large crew, but even with all the manpower, resources were scarce. The crew members worked tirelessly to keep the ship operational. At times, Blackbeard had to deal with unhappy crew members, many of whom were desperate for wealth and adventure. His position as captain was far from secure, and the ship itself was a constant reminder of the instability of life as a pirate. While pirate ships were often celebrated in folklore and film, their actual construction and upkeep were far from glamorous. Archaeological digs of pirate shipwrecks have revealed much about their condition. Many pirate ships were hastily converted merchant vessels or ships captured from enemy forces. These ships were not purpose-built for piracy but adapted for the task with whatever materials were available. The lack of proper maintenance often led to leaks, weakened hulls, and rotting wood, making pirates more vulnerable to the elements. Some ships had to be constantly patched up during voyages, leading to dangerous conditions at sea. The constant repairs, combined with the cramped living spaces, meant that pirates were often on edge, facing a never-ending battle to keep their ships afloat. In stark contrast to the pirates' unseaworthy vessels, the Navy's ships were built for endurance and stability. Naval fleets of the time were well maintained and designed for long-term voyages and combat. The crews aboard these ships had better living conditions, more resources, and were generally treated with more respect by their officers. Unlike pirates, naval sailors had a more structured existence, with predictable routines and guaranteed pay. The difference in ship quality between the pirate vessels and naval ships highlights the contrast between the pirates' precarious lifestyle and the stability of the Royal Navy. Imagine waking up to the sound of the creaking ship's hull again, your body sore from the previous day's labor. The constant motion of the ship, whether it's swaying gently in calm waters or rocking wildly in a storm, is a part of your daily life. The pirate ship you inhabit is no more than a floating hovel, with walls that seem to close in on you as you spend more time within. Yet, despite the hardships, the pirates aboard are driven by a singular goal: freedom. But freedom comes at a cost, and it's a cost felt deeply by those who must endure the ever-present dangers of life on the high seas. For pirates, there was always the looming threat of attack, whether from other pirates or the Navy. Life was one of constant vigilance, but even with the threat of danger always on the horizon, the pirates continued their raids, each time hoping for enough loot to survive and sustain them for a little longer. It wasn't just the possibility of death in battle. Pirates were also susceptible to disease. The lack of fresh food led to widespread scurvy, and poor sanitation often resulted in illnesses that spread like wildfire among the crew. But even though pirate crews often lived in squalor, there were moments where their sense of freedom allowed them to feel triumphant. After a successful raid, the crew would celebrate with what little they had: rum, bread, and salted meat, or whatever they could scrounge. These small victories kept them going, allowing them to fight on despite the daily suffering they endured. However, it was never enough to overshadow the reality of their dangerous existence. The pirate's life was one of fleeting highs and constant lows. Even the wealth obtained from a successful raid was often short-lived. Pirate ships were not designed to carry large stores of treasure, so any loot obtained had to be traded for goods necessary for survival: food, water, and repairs for the ship. And while the idea of buried treasure continues to linger in popular culture, it's important to note that pirates rarely had the time or resources to bury their loot. Instead, their treasure was usually spent quickly to maintain the ship and crew, or traded for provisions. There was always the looming danger of betrayal, too. The pirate crews often operated under the code of conduct, but that didn't mean everyone was loyal. Pirates were outcasts. Many had joined piracy after being abandoned by their previous lives, whether they were sailors, soldiers, or convicts. There was little trust between men who had nothing left to lose. Mutinies were not uncommon, and even the most successful pirate captains could fall from power if their crew grew dissatisfied. In these moments, the fragile alliances that held the crew together would collapse, and betrayal would tear through the ship like a storm. One of the most infamous examples of mutiny is that of Captain William Kidd, once a respected privateer turned pirate. His crew, dissatisfied with his leadership, eventually turned against him, and his career came to a swift end. Kidd was eventually captured and brought to trial, his story serving as a grim reminder of how precarious life was for a pirate captain. Even the most celebrated pirates were at the mercy of their crews, and the constant threat of mutiny loomed over every decision they made. Despite the hardships, There were those who thrived under the pirate code. Pirates who had successfully seized control of a ship enjoyed a relative sense of power. Pirate captains were often seen as figures of authority, but their power was tenuous, held only as long as the crew remained loyal. The captain's authority was typically dictated by the success of the crew, and in some cases, the crew would overthrow the captain if they felt their leader was no longer able to provide the wealth or protection they needed. But even when pirates managed to seize control of a ship, their success was not guaranteed. Every time they took a prize ship, there was the risk of encountering an enemy that was better equipped or more numerous. Pirates were, more often than not, outgunned and outnumbered. They relied on speed, agility, and surprise attacks to compensate for their lack of firepower. This made piracy a dangerous and unsustainable lifestyle, where every successful raid was met with the risk of retaliation from more powerful forces. The constant danger and instability made pirate ships feel like floating prisons, where freedom was elusive. For all the romanticism and adventure associated with piracy, the reality was one of hardship, constant threat, and a life where survival was never guaranteed. The pirate ship, while a symbol of rebellion and freedom to those who joined its ranks, was, in truth, a crucible where the harsh realities of life on the sea took their toll on everyone aboard. Life was not just about plundering merchant ships or evading naval forces. It was a constant struggle for survival in the unforgiving environment of the ocean. There were few luxuries, and the threat of death was a constant companion, whether from storms, disease, or rival pirates. Every day was a battle, not only with external forces but also with the ship itself. The vessel that carried them on their perilous adventures was often in a state of disrepair. Pirates didn't have access to the resources or time to properly maintain their ships, and many vessels were made up of parts scavenged from other ships or hastily repaired during brief stops at isolated islands. This lack of upkeep meant that pirate ships were not built to last. They were often leaky, unstable, and poorly equipped. Yet, the pirates continued, driven by the need to stay afloat and the belief that treasure and freedom awaited them. But the reality of maintaining a pirate ship was harsh. Every creak and groan of the ship's timbers was a reminder of the constant threat of disaster. Even during calm weather, the ship was never a safe haven. Every time pirates sailed into a storm, the uncertainty of survival loomed large, and the risk of damage to the ship was not just an inconvenient sight, was a matter of life and death. A badly damaged ship could quickly lead to the loss of the crew, the treasure, and the very life of the pirates aboard. This vulnerability also made piracy an inherently dangerous and unstable lifestyle. Pirates constantly lived on the edge, never sure when the next storm would tear through their ship, or when the British Navy, or worse, a rival pirate crew would come seeking revenge. Even the most successful pirate crews were ultimately at the mercy of these uncontrollable forces, and it was often only a matter of time before their luck ran out.
Pirate ships, however, were not just places of discomfort and danger, they were also centers of camaraderie and brutality. Life on board was characterized by a strange blend of freedom and lawlessness. Pirates, after all, were outlaws, and their world was one without the protections of law or government. Yet, while the pirate code offered a sense of stability, it was often ignored or bent when it suited the needs of those in power. The captain was expected to be a leader, but his authority could be overthrown if the crew felt dissatisfied or if the captain failed to deliver results. A well-stocked ship meant a brief respite from the hardships of the open Seymour food, better conditions, and a chance to repair the ship or rest. Every day was a battle against the elements, the law, and even each other. While the promise of treasure and freedom lured many men to the pirate life, the reality was a constant struggle for survival, a fight to stay alive and afloat in a world where death was never far away. But this comfort was fleeting. The loot they gathered, whether gold, silver, or goods, was often spent immediately on supplies for the ship or provisions for the crew. The sway of the vessel, especially in rough waters, was a feeling you could never escape. Every motion, every gust of wind, every wave was a reminder of how fragile your situation was. The thrill of the chase, the lure of treasure, and the belief in their own freedom kept them going. The constant exposure to danger, the relentless struggle for survival, and the lack of comfort created an atmosphere where frustration and tension were always simmering beneath the surface. You were surrounded by a crew of men who, for the most part, were strangers to you men who had joined the ship for reasons of their own, each with their own story of abandonment, desperation, or criminal intent. Crew members who were not used to the rigors of pirate life often grew restless. The initial excitement of joining a pirate crew wore off quickly, replaced by the harsh reality of what it took to stay alive. Food was scarce, and the monotony of sea life began to wear on everyone. The smell of unwashed bodies, the staleness of the air, and the constant wetness from the sea left everyone feeling filthy and uncomfortable. There were no moments of rest, no days off. Even the brief periods of calm were laced with anxiety, knowing that the next storm could destroy the ship, or the next battle could end your life. You shared a space with them, ate with them, and fought alongside them, but there was little sense of kinship. With little room to move, crew members were forced to live in close quarters. The smell of sweat, unwashed clothes, and the dampness of the ship's interior were constant. You would sleep in tight hammocks, side by side with other men, all struggling to find some comfort in the swaying, uncomfortable space. There was no privacy. There was no escape from the crew you had to live with, work with, and at times fight with. In the close quarters of a pirate ship, every man was a potential threat, and trust was a rare and fragile commodity. Pirate crews were volatile. Their loyalty was as shifting as the winds, and the slightest sign of weakness from a captain or crewmate could lead to mutiny. But the reality of their existence was far from the glamorous life of swashbuckling heroes. It was a life of danger, uncertainty, an exhaustional life, where every moment of success was quickly overshadowed by the harshness of the next challenge. The ship, which was meant to be a refuge, became a prison of sorts, one that could break apart at any moment. The spoils of a successful raid were fleeting.
Ow.
The pirate ship was a place of constant work, constant vigilance, and constant risk. Victory was only temporary, and it was often followed by the familiar dread of the next attack or the next challenge. Once the supplies ran low, the pirates would have to resume their predatory lifestyle, scavenging for food, water, and loot in order to survive. The life of a pirate captain was often just as precarious as that of a crew member, despite their higher rank. The sea was an unforgiving, hostile place, and pirates were constantly at its mercy. Storms could strike without warning, tearing apart a ship and its crew. Navigating treacherous waters was an art form, and even the most skilled sailors could make fatal mistakes. Pirates had no true safe harbor. They were always moving, always on the run from the naval forces or rival pirate crews. The freedom they sought was always out of reach, constantly slipping through their fingers. While there was a pirate code that governed how loot was divided, how disputes were settled, the world around you is in constant motion, the ship creaking underfoot, the sails snapping in the wind. Above, the sky is a deep, unbroken blue, but the very expanse of the ocean seems to stretch endlessly into the horizon, an unforgiving and dangerous place. Every moment on the sea is fraught with danger, uncertainty, and discomfort. Even the fleeting moments of calm bring little relief from the constant tension and vigilance. And how captains were chosen, the reality of enforcing these rules, was often a matter of force. The work was grueling, and there was never a moment of peace. Pirates were often underfed, with limited rations that left them malnourished and weak. Food was often salted meat, hardtack, or whatever they could steal from other ships. Fresh fruit was a rare luxury, and when it did appear, it was often too little to stave off scurvy, the deadly disease caused by a lack of vitamin C. Pirates suffered from ailments that would seem trivial today, but in the close quarters of a pirate ship, diseases spread quickly, decimating the crew. Pirates did not have the same social structures or laws that governed the societies they came from. Instead, they lived in a world where survival depended on strength, cunning, and loyalty, often maintained through intimidation. The pirate code was designed to bring some semblance of order to an otherwise chaotic existence. Pirates also had to deal with the ever-present threat of betrayal. Loyalty among pirate crews was essential, but pirates were not always the most trustworthy individuals. Unlike the navy or merchant ships, which had secure trade routes and regular access to ports, pirates were forced to rely on plundering merchant ships or making brief stops at islands to stock up on water, food, and other necessities. But these stops came with their own risks. Pirates had to remain constantly vigilant, as even the smallest sign of naval patrols or hostile forces could force them to abandon their supplies and flee. Many had turned to piracy because they had nothing left to lose: escaped slaves, sailors on abandoned ships, soldiers discharged after battle, and criminals fleeing the law. A group made up of so many different backgrounds, trust was always in short supply. Crews could mutiny at any time, and captains had to constantly balance the need for leadership with the desire to keep their crew loyal. The pirates' constant need for supplies was another factor that made life at sea so difficult. On these rare occasions when pirates were able to resupply, they would find themselves in a temporary state of abundance. The pirate's life, then, was defined by cycles of deprivation and indulgence. Moments of victory and loss, all framed within the confines of a ship that could be their savior or their tomb. Imagine standing on the deck of a pirate ship, the wind howling around you, the salty spray of the ocean stinging your face. For the average pirate, life aboard the ship was a series of endless routines: patching sails, scrubbing decks, and maintaining the ship's weapons. Even when pirates were successful in their raids, the reward was rarely enough to offer long-term comfort. The constant movement of the ship itself was another challenge. But the real prison of pirate life was not the ship, it was the ocean itself. Despite these hardships, pirates continued. Life aboard a pirate ship was not just about the constant threat of external enemies, but also about the emotional, mental toll it took on those who called the ship their home. The isolation of the pirate life was perhaps one of the most difficult aspects. The daily grind of life aboard the ship, combined with the isolation of being far from any land, made for a breeding ground for discontent. Pirate ships were often overcrowded, and this added to the tension. And yet, despite these unbearable conditions, there was always the chance of a big reward, a momentary escape from the misery. A successful raid could bring in enough loot to improve the situation, better accommodations, a chance to relax and enjoy a few fleeting moments of luxury. Battle was dangerous, and many pirates were killed or wounded in combat. It was not just the enemies they faced in battle that threatened their lives, but the very conditions of the sea. Illnesses spread quickly on pirate ships, and disease was a constant threat. But that same crew could icily turn on each other the next. This tension often stemmed from the lack of formal leadership structures. While there was a pirate captain, his authority was always contingent on the crew's approval. They were free to roam the seas, to choose their own fate, and to carve out their own paths in life. But this freedom was fraught with peril. The freedom to plunder came with the price of living outside the law, constantly hunted by naval forces. While pirates may have lived outside the societal norms, they were bound by a new set of rules, the rules of the pirate crew and the rules of the sea itself. The captain could be voted out if he failed to deliver, or if he lost favor with the crew, even after a successful raid. The sea, as much a threat as it was a source of sustenance, was always in the background, an unpredictable force that could take everything from them in an instant. The constant battles with rival pirates, the naval fleets, and even nature itself wore down the pirate spirit. The very nature of their existence, constantly on the move, created a mental and emotional toll that was often as dangerous as the physical battles they fought. While the sea could provide moments of freedom, it also isolated pirates from any real sense of home or stability. The pirate ship, in many ways, became both a refuge and a cage. Those who survived the longest did so not just by being strong or skilled in battle, but by being able to adapt to the ever-changing and ever-dangerous life at sea. The ship became their entire world. Everything they knew was centered around it. When pirates did return to port, it was often only for short stints to resupply or to offload their loot. The land was a place of fleeting interaction, a brief interlude before they were once again thrust out onto the open sea. This rootlessness became an integral part of the pirate experience. Pirates were outsiders, constantly looking for their next opportunity while never truly belonging anywhere. The pirate captain, despite having more power than the crew, was always walking a fine line. balancing their ability to command with the need to maintain the loyalty of the men under their command. It was a life where men lived by their wits, always on the edge of survival, always struggling to hold on to the small rewards that came their way. The fleeting moments of victory, the successful raids, the moments of luxury brought by treasure were just that, fleeting. The pirate's life was defined by uncertainty, by constant risk, and by the haunting awareness that their time on the seas could end at any moment. The lack of proper medical care meant that even a simple injury could become a death sentence. Many had turned to piracy after being abandoned by society, whether they were sailors left, adrift by the collapsing merchant economy, or criminals seeking refuge from the law. Pirate crews were often a melting pot of individuals who came from different walks of life. And while this made for a diverse and resourceful crew, it also created an atmosphere of distrust. The bonds between crew members were weak, built on necessity rather than true camaraderie. It didn't take much to unravel these fragile alliances and unfair distribution of loot. Perceived slight or a moment of weakness could all spark rebellion. Pirates were far more likely to die from sickness than from the sword. The pirate code, though rarely followed to the letter, established some semblance of democracy. Crews had a say in important matters, such as the division of spoils and the selection of captains. Many pirate ships allowed their men to vote on key decisions. A form of rule by consensus that was in stark contrast to the rigid hierarchies aboard naval ships or merchant vessels. But the pirate code was not a guarantee of fairness. While it promised equal shares of treasure, it did not ensure safety or stability. The pirate crew lived in a state of constant flux, and that uncertainty was part of what made pirate life so perilous. The promise of treasure and the adrenaline of a successful attack kept the pirates going. Even as they dealt with the harshness of life on board, it was not just the external dangers they had to contend with, but also the internal pressures, the constant stress of survival, the fear of mutiny, and the toll that life at sea took on their bodies and minds. It's the same qualities that made pirates appealing: adventure, rebellion. And the promise of wealth were also the forces that kept them in a state of constant tension. Even in the most prosperous of times, when loot was plentiful, the life of a pirate was one of fleeting comfort at best, and often it was far less than that. The life of a pirate was not one of freedom or adventure, but one of constant struggle, discomfort, and uncertainty. It was a life that demanded everything from those who lived it, and even the most hardened pirate could not escape the inevitable decay of time and the ravages of the sea. But these rewards were rare, and the grim reality of daily life often overshadowed the moments of success. Even as pirates fought and bled for treasure, there was the ever-present specter of death hanging over them. Life on a pirate ship was unforgiving. The pirate ship, while a symbol of freedom for many who sought to escape the rigid constraints of society, was also a floating microcosm of conflict and instability. The constant threat of betrayal was ever present on board. A pirate crew might fight side by side one moment, sharing in the spoils of a successful raid. Pirate ships were filled with men who had nothing left to lose. And yet, for all the chaos, there was a strange sense of equality among pirates. Pirates, however, did have a certain freedom that others lacked. Pirates were also deeply aware of their mortality. Life on a pirate ship was a paradox. It was a life that promised freedom, but delivered only hardship. The unpredictability of a pirate's life wasn't just confined to the external threats they faced. For the average pirate, there was no lasting place to call home, no steady community or family to rely on. The absence of a permanent home was compounded by the limited social interactions pirates had. While they lived in close quarters, sharing the same space and facing the same challenges, there was often little camaraderie among them. As much as pirates relied on each other for survival, they were also driven by their individual desires for treasure, freedom, and power. A captain's survival depended on his crew's willingness to follow him, and this trust was often fleeting. Their crews were made up of men from all walks of life, many of whom were desperate for a chance at wealth, freedom, or escape. Every victory was followed by the awareness that the next fight was always just around the corner. The very thing that drew them to piracy, the hope for a better life, away from the constraints of society, was also the thing that kept them in a state of constant survival. The pirate's existence was always marked by the knowledge that each day could be their last, and pirate crews were always at risk of being caught by naval forces. The British Navy in particular was constantly hunting down pirates, and their ships were often better equipped and faster than those of the pirates. They had sought freedom from the rigid structures of society, but in doing so, they had created a new set of rules that they could never escape. Their lives were defined by the need to constantly move, constantly fight, and constantly survive. While they may have rejected the constraints of land-based society, they found themselves bound by the laws of the sea, which were often just as unforgiving. The constant motion of the ship is a reminder of your isolation, far from the safe harbors and social structures you once knew. The sea, both your lifeline and your enemy, stretches endlessly before you. Even in the quiet moments, when the ship sails smoothly and the sun sets in brilliant colors across the horizon, there is always that nagging awareness, the knowledge that something could go wrong at any moment. There was no true escape from the dangers of piracy. Each pirate's life was constantly on the line, and survival meant balancing the pursuit of wealth and freedom with the reality of constant imminent threat. There was no time to relax, no time to enjoy the fruits of their labor. Even when they managed to find treasure or strike a successful blow against their enemies, the knowledge that they were always on the run, always hunted, tempered any sense of victory. One wrong decision could lead to disaster, whether it was attacking the wrong merchant vessel, underestimating the strength of a naval fleet, or sailing into a storm without the necessary supplies to weather it. Every day brought new risks, and pirates had no choice but to embrace this unpredictable lifestyle. Every pirate knew that death or capture could come at any time, and so they lived on the edge, always looking for their next opportunity, hoping to strike it rich before the inevitable downfall. Even successful pirates who managed to capture merchant ships or raid enemy ports faced the ever-present danger of retaliation. The threat of being captured and hung was a constant fear, and many pirates met their end in just such a way. Whether from a naval encounter, a storm, disease, or even a betrayal within their own crew, pirates were always at the mercy of the unpredictable world they inhabited. When a raid was successful, the pirates were able to celebrate with what little they had. The spoils of a successful raid, gold, silver, and other valuables, could provide a temporary escape from the hardships of daily life. Beneath that freedom lay a constant tension, a constant fight for survival. Pirates were free in the sense that they were not bound by the laws of society, but they were also bound by their need for survival, their need for loot, and their constant fear of betrayal. This made their lives both exhilarating and exhausting, a cycle of highs and lows, success and failure, of freedom and imprisonment. However, these moments of luxury were short-lived. Pirates had no real home, and once the treasure was spent or traded for supplies, they were back to the constant grind of survival. Even the thrill of success could not stave off the reality of their difficult lives. Pirates were constantly on the run, hunted by the very governments they sought to escape. Even when they succeeded in a raid, the threat of retaliation from the British Navy or rival pirates always loomed large. In many ways, the pirate life was defined by a cycle of struggle for survival, for treasure, and for the fleeting sense of freedom that came with it. These men had little in common aside from their shared desire to live outside the law. The lack of formal structure often resulted in disorganization and chaos. While the pirate code provided a loose framework for conduct, it wasn't always followed to the letter, and the captain had to maintain control by sheer force of will. Pirates were, by nature, rebels fighting for freedom, but never able to escape the harsh consequences of their rebellion. If a captain failed to deliver results, or if the crew grew dissatisfied with their lot, mutiny was always a real threat. Pirate ships, therefore, were not just battlegrounds against enemy ships or the Navy. They were also sites of constant internal struggle, where power and loyalty were constantly tested. Crew members were often strangers who had nothing in common except their present circumstances. Pirates were always on the move, searching for their next target, constantly sailing into dangerous waters in pursuit of plunder. While the image of pirates lounging on sandy beaches with treasures and rum is common in popular culture, the reality was far more chaotic. Pirates were often forced to stay on the move, never staying in one place too long, lest they be discovered by the authorities or rival pirates. Their world was one of constant motion and uncertainty. This lack of genuine connection made the pirate ship an emotionally isolating place. Even when pirates celebrated the spoils of a successful raid, it was often a hollow victory. The fleeting joy of victory was soon replaced by the harsh reality of their perilous existence. Pirates also had to grapple with the constant fear of betrayal. Mutinies were not uncommon on pirate ships, as the harsh conditions could easily sour a crew's loyalty. A captain who grew too comfortable, too lax, could find himself deposed by his own men. Even the most skilled and fearsome pirates were vulnerable to the whims of their crews. Take, for instance, the story of Captain Stede Bonnet, who, despite his wealth and noble background, was ultimately betrayed by his own men. Bonnet's crew, unsatisfied with his leadership, voted to abandon him, setting the stage for his eventual capture and execution. His downfall highlights the fragile nature of power aboard a pirate ship, where loyalty was constantly in question. The ever-present possibility of mutiny and the fragile alliances within pirate crews meant that leadership had to be earned not just through strength or charisma, but through the ability to inspire trust and loyalty. Pirates had little formal training or discipline. The lives of pirates were often fleeting. Pirate crews were constantly moving, searching for new ships to plunder, new opportunities for survival. Pirates, despite their desire for freedom, found themselves caught in a cycle of perpetual uncertainty. Life on a pirate ship was never a steady, predictable journey. The pirate life was also one of incredible danger. A pirate ship could be caught in a storm at any time. Despite this, there were moments when the pirates felt a fleeting sense of triumph. Pirates, in many ways, were trapped by their own choices. The life of a pirate was one of paradoxes. It was a life of freedom, but only on the surface. As pirates continued their journeys across the vast, unpredictable seas, they began to realize the inherent limitations of their freedom. Imagine yourself as a pirate aboard one of these ships, feeling the waves rise beneath you and the wind whip against the sails. Pirates often lived in the shadow of this uncertainty. Their ship, no matter how fast or well-armed, was always vulnerable. The pirate code, though it provided some semblance of order, did little to alleviate the tension of daily life. While pirates could agree on how to divide treasure and handle disputes, there was little in the way of real protection from the dangers of their environment. A pirate ship was a diverse collection of individuals, many of whom had turned to piracy to escape lives of hardship or punishment. Some were former soldiers, some were runaway slaves, and others were simply men and women who had nothing to lose. While this diversity often made the crew more adaptable, it also made unity difficult to maintain. The promise of a life outside the law, of freedom on the open sea, became less appealing as the years went on. They lived for freedom but were shackled by their own choices. They sought treasure and wealth, yet found themselves living in squalor, always on the run. There were no guarantees that the next raid would be successful, or that the crew would survive the attack, the storm, or the pursuit of the Navy. They rarely returned to port, except for brief, desperate resupplies, and the concept of a home was foreign to them. They lived in constant transit, never settling anywhere for long. The sea, which had once symbolized freedom, became their prison, vast, unrelenting, and unforgiving. While there was often a sense of camaraderie between crew members, this bond was fragile and easily broken. Jealousy over shares of loot, disagreements over leadership, or fear of mutiny could quickly turn friends into enemies. Many pirates lived in constant fear of being betrayed by their own men. As the ship was filled with individuals who had no loyalty to each other except for the common goal of survival, the pirate code, which was meant to bring some order and stability to the crew, was often ignored or manipulated when it suited someone's personal interests. The pirate ship was a volatile place where the balance of power could shift at any moment, and that constant instability created an atmosphere of anxiety and distrust. And for all the romanticized tales of pirate treasure, few ever found lasting wealth. Most pirates died without a penny to their name, either in battle or after being captured by the Navy. The pirate life, for all its promises, was often a cycle of brief moments of success, followed by long stretches of hardship, illness, and impending death. The ship that carried the pirates was always vulnerable to the elements, to sickness, and to the ever-present danger of being caught by more powerful naval forces. Crew members were often separated from their families and loved ones, and many of them found it difficult to adjust to the isolation of life at sea. The mental strain of constant vigilance, of never knowing what the next day would bring, wore on many of the men who chose this life. The stress of leadership weighed heavily on pirate captains who had to make split-second decisions that could mean the difference between survival and death. Even the most successful pirate leaders, like Blackbeard and Bartholomew Roberts, were not immune to the emotional exhaustion that came with being on the run, constantly hunted by those seeking to end their reigns. Many pirates turned to alcohol or other vices to cope with the pressures of their existence. Even when they managed to secure a safe harbor, it was only temporary. Pirates could never escape the fact that they were living on borrowed time. They were hunted by the very forces they had once rebelled against. No matter how many ships they'd captured, no matter how much wealth they acquired, their freedom was always fragile. Even if they succeeded in taking a merchant ship, there was no certainty that their loot would last. Supplies were often meager, and once the gold was spent on provisions or repairs, the pirates were right back where they started, facing another long, grueling journey across the ocean. They rejected society's rules, but in doing so, they created their own set of unstable, dangerous rules. The pursuit of freedom, for all its allure, was never truly realized for the pirates. They were trapped in a never-ending cycle of survival, constantly fighting to maintain the freedom they so desired, but always knowing that one misstep could lead to their downfall. Some pirates, exhausted from the violence and instability, turned to less dangerous forms of life, becoming privateers, or even retiring to small, quiet lives on land. But even with the occasional successful plunder, pirates could never fully escape the shadow of their criminal existence. Each new raid was simply a brief respite from the harshness of their reality. And for most pirates, these small victories only underscored the bitter truth that their freedom came at an unbearable cost. But for many, the pirate life was all they knew, and it was not so easily abandoned. Once a pirate, always a pirate, a phrase that rang true for many, even in their final moments. Rivalries could spring up at any time, and jealousy over loot or leadership could spark conflicts. The lack of clear, stable leadership aboard a pirate ship often led to power struggles that made every moment aboard the ship a battle for dominance. If a pirate captain was too weak or too harsh, the crew could mutiny. They were hunted by naval forces from various nations, their names on wanted posters, their ships marked for destruction. While they reveled in their freedom from the laws of land-based societies, they were always aware that they were not free from the law of the sea. The British Royal Navy, the Spanish Armada, other naval powers actively pursued pirates, hunting them down with the full force of their fleets. Pirates knew that no matter how many successful raids they completed, they could never truly escape the consequences of their outlaw lives. If a crew was too divided, they might fail to work together when a battle or a raid was needed most. For many pirates, the price of freedom was death either in battle or at the gallows. The executions of captured pirates were often public spectacles, meant to serve as a warning to others who might be tempted by the life of piracy. Despite the rewards of gold, treasure, and the thrill of the chase, pirates knew that the end of their story was most likely going to be grim, whether it was hanging by the neck or being shot in battle. The death of a pirate was a certainty, one that haunted their every move. Pirate ships were often a fragile form of government, held together by the most tenuous of bonds, greed, necessity, and the hope of treasure. Even within the crew, relationships were often strained. Pirates also had to contend with the constant knowledge that they were seen as criminals by the larger world. The threat of capture and execution was an ever-present specter. The harshness of this existence took its toll. Even the most hardened pirates grew weary of the constant tension, the endless pursuit of treasure, and the ever-present fear of capture. In many ways, the pirate's life was defined by its contradictions. As the pirate ship sailed on, the crew moved ever closer to the next raid or escape. Constantly guided by the rhythms of the sea and the promise of riches, the promise of treasure was always on the horizon. But for many pirates, it was nothing more than a fleeting dream. Pirates were, by nature, survivors. The majority of their lives were spent on the move, always searching for the next opportunity. The constant movement and instability were exhausting, both physically and emotionally. In addition to the constant fear of capture, pirates had to deal with the emotional toll of their lives. Pirates also had to navigate the complex relationships within their crews. Despite all these challenges, pirates kept sailing, kept fighting, chasing the elusive dream of freedom. They were, at their core, rebels men who had chosen to live outside the structures of society, to reject the rules that bound most people. The endless pursuit of freedom and treasure often feels like an unattainable dream, one that is as elusive as the horizon that constantly stretches before them. Even after a successful raid, when the crew divided the loot, the rewards were often short-lived. Much of the treasure was used immediately for necessities: fresh water, food, repairs, and even medical supplies. In battle, they faced the possibility of being killed by gunfire or sword, their bodies left to rot in the open sea. But death was not just a risk in combat. Illness was an ever-present danger on pirate ships, where diseases like scurvy and dysentery spread rapidly. Pirates lived in cramped, unsanitary conditions, and even minor injuries could become fatal without proper medical care. This fear of death was always in the background, reminding the crew that their lives were expendable, that no pirate ship was immune from the ravages of time, illness, and injury. The ship, despite being their only means of survival, became a source of both comfort and confinement. On one hand, the crew was united by the common goal of survival and the hope for treasure. But on the other hand, they were bound by the stark realities of their situation. The constant struggle to keep the ship afloat, the harsh conditions of life on board, their names may have become legends. Their faces immortalized in stories, but their lives were often filled with pain and hardship. The pirate captains, once feared for their power and leadership, were as vulnerable as their crews. Many, like Blackbeard and Bartholomew Roberts, met violent ends, either in battle or at the hands of their own men. The pirate captain's role, though powerful, was never secure, and the position came with its own set of dangers. A mutiny could strike at any time, and the crew could easily dispose of their leader if they felt that he no longer served their interests, and the ever-present threat of mutiny or betrayal created an environment where trust was hard to come by. Even the strongest bonds could be torn apart by fear, hunger, or jealousy. In such an environment, pirates had little room for meaningful relationships. The sense of isolation was pervasive, even among the crew members who shared the same hardships. It was a place where pirates were bound together by their shared struggles, yet also a space where their isolation from the rest of society became ever more pronounced. They were free from the rules of law and government, but they were not free from the reality of their own existence. The long voyages, the constant tension, and the ever-present danger from both the sea and the law wore down the spirits of many pirates. Some would succumb to the brutal conditions, their bodies breaking down from disease or injury. Others, worn out by the constant uncertainty, would abandon piracy altogether, seeking refuge on land, where they hoped to escape the dangers of the open sea. But for many, there was no escape. The pirate's life was a one-way journey, one that led inevitably toward either death or capture. The freedom they sought was always just beyond their grasp, a fleeting moment of joy in a life defined by struggle. These were the true costs of the pirate life: the constant need for sustenance, the never-ending cycle of repairs, trust, while an essential part of the pirate code was fragile. But even with the occasional successful raid, treasure was often fleeting, spent quickly on supplies and repairs for the ship. The reality of pirate life was that even when they captured a ship or raided a port, the spoils rarely lasted long enough to offer any real comfort. The ship, their only home, was a constant reminder of the transient nature of their wealth and the unrelenting struggle for survival. Every bit of treasure was just another temporary relief from the hardships of their existence. They sought freedom, but often found themselves trapped in a never-ending cycle of violence, uncertainty, and hardship. There were no guarantees of safety or reward. Pirates might escape the law for a while, but they could never escape the brutal reality of life at sea. The myth of the free-spirited pirate living a life of wealth and adventure was just that: a myth. For most, it was a constant struggle, a life spent on the run from both the law and the elements. Every pirate knew that their comrades could turn on them at any moment. Whether through mutiny or betrayal, there was always the possibility that the very people you sailed with could be the ones who brought about your downfall. This uncertainty created an atmosphere of paranoia on the ship. Even the strongest leaders, like Blackbeard or Bartholomew Roberts, were not immune to the possibility of a mutiny. A pirate captain's fate was never certain, and even those who led successful raids could find themselves cast aside or killed by their own men. and the inability to ever fully enjoy the fruits of their labor. Pirates, for all their bravado and ambition, were ultimately bound by the harsh realities of life at sea. The crew might celebrate their victories, but there was always an awareness that those victories were fleeting. The horizon was always shifting, just out of reach, and the dream of freedom was never fully realized. Pirates may have sought to live outside the rules of society, but in doing so, they had created a world where every day was a battle for survival. Every moment of peace on the ship is fleeting, and there is no true escape from the tensions that simmer beneath the surface. They might indulge in a brief celebration, drinking rum and recounting their victories, but these moments were often hollow. The crew would quickly return to the grind of ship life, the familiar tasks of sailing, fighting, and surviving, taking precedence once more. Pirates never had the chance to relax or truly savor their rewards. Their lives were dominated by the constant need to survive, both as individuals and as a crew. For every pirate, there is the constant understanding that the life they lead, one built on rebellion and survival, comes with a heavy price. But in doing so, they had created a new set of rules, ones that were just as unpredictable, dangerous, and difficult to live by. The pirate's life, for all its excitement and promise, was ultimately a life of uncertainty, where survival was never guaranteed, and where death was always waiting just beyond the horizon. As the pirate ship cuts through the waves, the crew knows that each day could be their last. The promise of riches and adventure that drew so many to piracy was rarely realized in full. Even in their rare moments of luxury, pirates found that nothing could truly erase the exhaustion that came with their existence. Pirates were also constantly haunted by the specter of death. In addition to the physical dangers, pirates also had to deal with the emotional toll of constant instability. For the average crew member, the pirate life was defined by a deep sense of longing. The pirate ship, in many ways, was a reflection of the life of the crew aboard its unstable, unpredictable, and full of tension. As the days wore on, the pirate ship remained a constant reminder of the fragile nature of life at sea. The pirate ship was a paradox, a place of both camaraderie and tension, of unity and discord. For many pirates, the promise of treasure was the driving force that kept them going. The reality of the pirate's life became even clearer as time went on. Even the pirates who survived the longest were never immune to the reality of their existence. The romanticized image of the pirate, so often depicted in stories and films, does little to capture the true essence of their existence. The pirate life was one of constant danger, exhaustion, and fear. There was no treasure chest overflowing with gold, no endless adventure or excitement. They lived day by day, always searching for the next opportunity to raid or plunder. There was no stability, no return to a warm hearth, or a safe place to rest. Many pirates had turned to piracy in the first place, because they had nowhere else to go. They were often outcasts from society men, who had lost everything, whether due to poverty, war, or personal misfortune. Pirate crews were made up of a diverse collection of individuals, each with their own reasons for abandoning the traditional structures of society. Pirates, for all their bravado and promises of freedom, lived lives in constant motion, forever searching for the next raid or the next escape. This pirate code, however, was not universal. Each ship had its own version, its own interpretation of how things should be done. Some captains followed it rigidly, believing it to be the foundation of their crew's success, while others used it as a mere suggestion, bending the rules to suit their needs. Despite the promises of equal shares and democratic decision-making, life aboard a pirate ship was rarely egalitarian. Some pirates, especially those with more experience, had a greater share of the loot. Others, particularly the new recruits, were often left with little to show for their labor. While the pirate code may have provided a framework for dividing treasure, it did little to solve the deeper issues of loyalty and trust within the crew. The captain and officers were often seen as above the rest, enjoying better accommodations and greater privileges. But in times of hunger, fear, or uncertainty, this division between the ranks became even more apparent, and resentment could quickly build up. In a world where lawlessness was the rule, the pirate code was a fragile attempt at structure, a structure that could, at any moment, unravel. The life of a pirate was one of constant tension with the law, with rival pirates, and even with the crew. Every day was a gamble, and every raid carried with it the risk of disaster. Even the treasure they fought so hard for was never guaranteed to bring lasting comfort. It was spent quickly, traded for food, or used to repair the ship. And when the treasure ran out, pirates were left with nothing but the same old grind. It's the same uncertainty, the same struggle to survive. There were no routes, no permanent place to rest. But in the end, it was the captain's authority that held the crew together. Pirate captains, despite their higher rank, were always walking a fine line. If the crew became dissatisfied with their leadership, whether due to a poor decision or a lack of results, mutiny could be a real threat. Even the most feared pirates were not immune to the possibility of being deposed or killed by their own men. The constant risk of mutiny made pirate leadership a precarious position, and the captain had to constantly balance maintaining control with keeping the crew loyal. They were fugitives on the run, bound to the sea, and to the unpredictability of the life they had chosen. Yet, despite their shared struggle, they were never truly united in the way that a true community would be. The pirate ship was a place where men lived in close quarters, but true bonds of trust were difficult to form. Each new port they visited brought with it the same challenges: resupplying their ship, avoiding the authorities, and dealing with the dangers of rival pirate crews. The life of a captain was one of constant decision-making, where every choice could determine the fate of the ship and its crew. The pirates' livelihood depended on their ability to capture merchant vessels, avoid detection by naval forces, and navigate the ever-changing landscape of the seas. But the captain's leadership was never guaranteed. A pirate captain had to remain sharp, decisive, and above all, respected. If a captain lost the respect of the crew, their reign could end abruptly, often with their death. Pirates sought freedom from the constraints of society, but in doing so, they created a new set of constraints: a life of constant motion, constant danger, and constant uncertainty. Yet, for most pirates, that promise was never fully realized. Even after a successful raid, when the pirates divided the loot, the treasure was often spent just as quickly on food, repairs, and the necessities of survival. The true cost of piracy was not just the danger of battle or the risk of capture, but the emotional toll of living a life on the edge. Pirates might experience moments of triumph, but those moments were always fleeting, overshadowed by the constant grind of survival. There was no time for rest, no time to savor the rewards of their labor. The pirate's life, for all its excitement and potential for wealth, was ultimately defined by its fleeting pleasures and constant struggles. Their freedom was always bound by the sea, and every decision they made had consequences. A successful raid might bring temporary satisfaction, but the dangers of the open ocean always loomed. Pirates might celebrate the spoils of a victory, but they knew that the next challenge, the next storm, or the next naval pursuit was never far away. The idea of ever finding true peace or contentment was a distant dream. Pirates by nature were always on the move, driven by the necessity of survival rather than the desire for long-term success. The reality of piracy was far more mundane and brutal, an endless cycle of struggle, with brief moments of triumph before being pulled back into the chaos of the sea. Pirates were not the free-spirited adventurers we often think of, but rather desperate men and women, living on the edge, fighting for their survival in a world that offered little in the way of stability or security. As the pirate ship cuts through the waves, the crew finds themselves once again caught in the constant rhythm of survival. The winds might be favorable for a time, and the ship may glide smoothly through the water. But beneath the surface, the same dangers loom. The same uncertainty about the future is always present, and even the most experienced pirate knows that each day could be their last. The bonds between pirates were often transactional, forged out of necessity rather than genuine friendship. While they fought alongside each other in battle, shared in the spoils of a successful raid, and relied on each other for survival, there was always the awareness that this was a temporary arrangement. Once the crew had no more use for one another, they would move on, either seeking new crews, new opportunities, or simply disappearing into the vast expanse of the ocean. The sea, which offers both freedom and peril, never gives pirates the luxury of feeling secure. Pirate life, with its constant motion, meant that pirates never truly settled anywhere. The sense of isolation that permeated pirate life was profound. Despite the camaraderie shared by the crew, there was always a layer of emotional distance between the men. This isolation was not just physical, but emotional. In many ways, the pirate life was a life of constant escape. The promise of treasure, of wealth, and of living outside the law was a powerful lure for many. As the pirate ship sails onward, the crew remains tethered to the same cycle of survival, each day unfolding with the uncertainty of what the next might bring. Life on a pirate ship was governed by a loose, unwritten coda, set of rules meant to maintain order amidst the chaos. The pirate code dictated the division of spoils, the responsibilities of the crew, and the consequences for misconduct. Even when a pirate captain was successful and revered by their crew, the pressure was immense. For the average pirate crew member, the pirate code offered a semblance of fairness, but it was never fully implemented. While pirates may have been free from the restrictions of society, they were never free from the dangers that came with their outlaw lives. The pirate's existence was not one of endless adventure, as the stories often suggest. Instead, it was defined by hardship, fleeting moments of success, and the constant struggle for survival. The thrill of the chase, the excitement of a successful raid, was always tempered by the awareness that the next battle could be their last. Pirates lived on the edge, and this existence, though appealing to many, was a brutal one. The crew, despite being part of a larger collective, was divided by individual ambitions, desires, and grievances. They lived in squalid conditions, eating what little food they could find, dealing with diseases like scurvy and dysentery, and constantly enduring the hardships of life on the open sea. Even when they managed to raid a successful prize, the treasure was quickly consumed by the necessities of their existence, buying provisions, repairing the ship, or paying off debts owed to the less honorable individuals who might have provided them with supplies. It was a lifestyle that offered the chance to escape the rigid constraints of society, to live without the rules that bound others. Pirates, despite their ambitions and desires for wealth, were never truly free from the harsh realities of their existence. The promise of treasure was always just beyond reach, like a mirage in the distance. For most pirates, there was no grand retirement or peaceful life waiting for them. Instead, they knew that they would either die fighting, be captured and executed, or meet an untimely end from illness or accident. The pirate ship, despite its promise of adventure and freedom, became a reminder that freedom was always fleeting. The pirates had sought to escape the confines of society, but they had unknowingly created their own set of rules, a set of rules that offered no security, no stability, and no way out. The thrill of the chase, the adrenaline of battle, could not mask the constant tension that hung over the crew. Even in their moments of victory, when treasure was divided and the crew celebrated, the ship remained a place of unease. Pirates lived on the edge, always knowing that their luck could change in an instant. But this freedom was a double-edged sword. Pirates, for all their bravado and rebellion, were ultimately enslaved by the very conditions that defined their lives. They were bound to the sea, to the ever-present danger of capture, and to the unpredictability of the life they had chosen. There was no sense of home, no place to rest and recover. Life on a pirate ship was often marked by exhaustion, isolation, and the constant fear of death. The emotional toll of this lifestyle was enormous. Pirates often turned to alcohol or other vices to cope with the constant stress. Even when they celebrated a successful raid, the relief was always short-lived. There was no time to truly enjoy their victories, no time to rest. Pirates had to keep moving, keep fighting, keep surviving. Every port they entered, every island they visited was temporary. They were always moving, always on the run. Pirates were constantly searching for treasure, but they were also searching for something more elusive, a place to belong. The ship was their only home, but it was a home that was constantly in danger of being destroyed. Every raid, every skirmish, every storm was a reminder that their lives were fragile. The freedom they had sought was always at risk. They may have sought to live outside the law, but in doing so, they created a new set of laws, a set of dangers and realities that could never be escaped. Even with treasure in hand, the pirate's life was one of constant struggle. There was no time to rest. There was always another ship to raid, another battle to fight, another storm to weather. The promise of treasure, though motivating, often fueled as much conflict as it did unity. While they may have lived outside the laws of society, they were not immune to the law of the sea, the British Navy, the Spanish Armada. and other naval powers were all in pursuit of the pirates who had chosen to live outside the established order. These naval forces had greater resources, better ships, and more manpower. Pirates, on the other hand, had speed and cunning on their side, but these could only carry them so far. A pirate's share of loot could vary depending on their rank and experience, and the allocation of spoils was rarely enough to prevent dissatisfaction from brewing below the surface. But the reality of piracy was that even the most feared pirate captains were eventually brought down, either through naval action or betrayal from within their own ranks. The pirate captain, while holding a certain amount of power, was never truly secure. Even the wealthiest and most successful pirate captains like Bartholomew Roberts ultimately faced a tragic end. Captured or killed by the very forces they had spent their lives evading. The reality of pirate life was defined by struggle, not just with external enemies, but with the very nature of piracy itself. The pursuit of treasure and freedom was always overshadowed by the dangers of living a life outside the law. As the days drifted on and the pirate ship moved through the unpredictable waters of the Caribbean or the coast of Africa, the crew could not escape the ever-present reality of their lives. The pirates were bound to the sea, constantly moving, constantly searching, constantly fighting for survival. Even in moments of apparent peace, when the ship floated through calm waters, and the wind was favorable, there was always a looming awareness that danger was just beyond the horizon. Pirates were never free from this tension. The external dangers naval forces rival pirates, storms were bad enough. But perhaps the most insidious challenge pirates faced was their own internal divisions. While the pirate ship was a place of relative freedom compared to the strict hierarchies of Navy ships, the sense of camaraderie among the crew was often fragile. Pirates were survivors, men who had often been rejected by society and had nowhere else to go. As such, loyalty was never guaranteed, and trust was hard to come by. Even in the midst of a shared goal, surviving and plundering, the bonds between pirate crew members could be quickly broken. While the pirate code promised a certain degree of fairness, especially in the division of spoils, this sense of fairness was often superficial. For the average pirate, there was little reward beyond survival. The pirates' quest for freedom was also tempered by the awareness that they were always being hunted. The most feared pirates were often those who had become notorious for their cruelty, like Blackbeard or Edward Lowe. Despite this, the promise of freedom, adventure, and wealth continued to lure men to piracy. As the pirate ship sailed through yet another stretch of open water, there was always the sense that time was slipping away, that each day brought them closer to the inevitable end. For the crew, the ship was not just their vessel, but their prison, and the sea was the only way out. The lack of permanence in a pirate's life was perhaps the most difficult aspect to bear. This instability affected not only the physical well-being of the pirates, but also their mental state. And yet, despite all the hardships, there was something undeniably powerful about the pirates' quest for freedom. Pirates rejected the rigid structures of society, the rules that governed the lives of those on land. While they lived outside the constraints of law and government, they also lived without the protection or stability that came with society's rules. The sea, though vast and seemingly endless, is never a true escape. It offers no refuge, no shelter from the harshness of pirate life. Every day is a battle for survival, and every victory, no matter how fleeting, is overshadowed by the constant realization that tomorrow could bring a new danger, a new threat, or the end of it all. The pirate code, though often loosely followed, served as a guiding principle, albeit one that could be easily bent or broken. Some sought the promise of wealth. Others sought escape from oppression or the law. But in the tight quarters of a pirate ship, those differences were bound to create tensions. The promise of treasure was often the only thing that kept the crew together, but it was not always enough to mask the deeper tensions. They lived with the belief that freedom was something worth fighting for, even if it meant living outside the law. The ship is their world, the sea their only constant. Pirates may have sought freedom from the constraints of society, but in doing so, they created their own set of rigid and unforgiving rules. The crew would go months without seeing land, their days marked by long hours of work, preparation, and vigilance. Even the most mundane tasks, scrubbing the decks, repairing sails, or cleaning weapons were vital to the survival of the crew. The smallest oversight could be disastrous, and no one was exempt from the rigors of ship life. Pirates worked hard to keep their vessel in shape, not for the sake of luxury, but for the sake of staying alive. In a way, the ship was an extension of the crew itself, both fragile and resilient, built to withstand the hardships of the sea, but always at risk of falling apart under the pressure. The very freedom they sought was always tempered by the danger and instability of their existence. Their lives were defined by the quest for treasure, but even more than that, they were defined by the need for survival. Treasure offered the chance of comfort, a momentary escape from the struggle, but it was never enough to offer a lasting solution. Pirates, in the end, were bound by their need to keep moving. Whether it was raiding merchant ships, resupplying at remote islands, or seeking out new territories to plunder, there was always another challenge on the horizon. A pirate ship was not a sanctuary, it was a battleground, constantly besieged by both internal and external threats. It was a place where the lines between survival and destruction were always blurred, and where a single misstep could lead to disaster. Even as the horizon stretches out before them, the uncertainty of the future weighs heavily. Pirates live in a perpetual state of flux, with no real control over their fate. The laws of society are far behind them, but the laws of nature and survival are omnipresent. Every day is a balancing act, a fight against the forces of nature, hunger, and the ever-looming threat of betrayal. For some, piracy was a means to an end, a way to escape the rigid structures of society and claim a measure of autonomy. For others, it was a path born of desperation, a choice made because there was no other way to survive. But in the end, piracy was a double-edged sword offering freedom, but only at the cost of constant danger and uncertainty. Even those who lived through it all knew that the end would come either through a naval defeat, a fatal injury, or the slow decay of the pirate's body from years of hardship and ill health. Crew members who had been with the ship for longer could find themselves pitted against newer recruits. Disagreements over how treasure should be divided or over the captain's leadership could quickly escalate into violence. Pirate ships were a microcosm of the instability that defined piracy itself, constantly shifting, constantly changing, always on the brink of collapse. A crew member who had been with the ship for months could be as easily replaced as a new recruit. Loyalty was not easily earned, and even the most successful pirate captains struggled to maintain control over their crews. Mutinies were common, and a captain's rule could quickly unravel if the crew's respect was lost. It was a system born of necessity rather than desire, a way to maintain some semblance of structure in a world ruled by chaos. A captain may have commanded respect at the beginning of their journey, but their authority was always in question. There was no formal institution to support them, no navy or government to back them up. Their position was based on their ability to lead and to deliver results. A pirate captain had to balance the needs of the crew with the demands of survival on the open sea. This often meant making hard decisions that could cost them their position if the crew didn't agree with them. Even the most famous and feared pirate captains, like Blackbeard and Charles Vane, were not immune to the threat of mutiny. Their leadership could be challenged at any moment, and their fate was ultimately in the hands of the men they commanded. The pirate code dictated the division of loot, the duties of the crew, and the consequences for disobedience. But the code was not foolproof. It was designed to keep pirates united, but it could also fracture under the strain of hunger, thirst, and greed. The freedom they sought was always tempered by the dangers of piracy, the constant fear of betrayal, the ever-present threat of capture or death, and the harsh conditions that defined their existence. Unlike the lives of merchants or naval officers, whose careers were defined by structure, routine, and security, pirates existed in a perpetual state of flux. There was no retirement plan for a pirate, no path to a quiet life on land. Their wealth, when they managed to acquire it, was rarely enough to escape the relentless demands of the pirate's life. For many, treasure was spent quickly on repairs, food, or simply to stay alive. In the end, a pirate's wealth was often fleeting, and the time spent on the open seas only increased their vulnerability. For most pirates, the price of freedom was far greater than they had ever imagined. They lived outside the law, creating their own system of governance, their own set of values. No, they lived without the constraints that others were forced to endure. It was this sense of freedom, this escape from the conventional world that kept them going. Even when the reality of their lives was far from glamorous, they lived a life of defiance, a life that rejected authority and embraced the wild, unpredictable nature of the sea. But freedom, as pirates soon realized, came at a cost. The life they had chosen was a double-edged sword. As the pirate ship sails further into unknown waters, the weight of the crew's collective burdens becomes ever more palpable. Even as pirates continued to plunder and seize treasure, their lives remained rooted in uncertainty. Pirates, despite their reputation for lawlessness, lived by their own form of order. The divisions between crew members were inevitable. Pirates were a mixture of former sailors, soldiers, outcasts, and criminals each, with their own reasons for abandoning the traditional systems of authority. Even within the hierarchy of pirate leadership, power was fragile. For the average pirate crew member, life on the ship was defined by these constant power struggles. Despite all the struggles and hardships, pirates continued to pursue their lives on the high seas. As the pirate ship cuts through the endless expanse of water, the crew can only wonder how much longer they can continue this life. There is a stark contrast between the pirate's life and the lives of those on land. Life aboard the pirate ship was always in a state of flux. The lack of permanent land to call home meant that pirates were always in search of their next prize. The pirate's life is defined by contradictions. They seek freedom, but they are bound by the unrelenting demands of survival. They seek treasure, but they are never allowed to truly enjoy it. They seek to live outside society, but in doing so, they create their own system, one that is just as dangerous and unstable as the world they left behind. There is no escape from the cramped quarters, from the smell of sweat and salt water that clings to the wooden planks beneath their feet. The physical toll of life at sea, exposure to the elements, lack of proper food, the strain of constant vigilance stakes, its toll on the pirates' bodies. In a world defined by chaos and lawlessness, trust is a rare and fragile thing. Pirate crews are often made up of men from all walks of life, men who have turned to piracy for reasons of survival, vengeance, or rebellion. The bonds between them are not forged by kinship or community, but by the shared need to survive and plunder. They sought freedom, but their lives were bound to the unpredictability of the sea. They pursued treasure, but their spoils were always fleeting. Perhaps a few precious pieces of dried fruit if the crew had been lucky at port. Ropes to coil, weapons to clean, lookouts to keep. The air was thick with the smell of sweat, smoke, and mildew. Rats scurried through the food stores. Disease was common: scurvy, dysentery, fever. A small wound could fester. A cough could become a death sentence. There was no doctor. Only makeshift remedies and crude surgeries performed with trembling hands and dull blades. Men groaned through the night, and there was no rest to be found in the swaying darkness below. And all the while a constant awareness that at any moment another ship might appear on the horizon. But even these moments were brief. The call of duty could come at any time, and no one dared ignore it. Punishment was swift lashes from the cat o' nine tails, or worse, marooning on a desolate shore with nothing but a bottle of water and a pistol with one shot. Justice aboard a pirate ship was harsh and unfeeling, and the rules, though born of rebellion, were still rules. To defy them was to invite misery. Perhaps a merchant vessel, slow and ripe for plunder, or perhaps a naval frigate, with a crew trained to kill and orders to hang any pirate they captured. Each new sail brought a rush of blood, a tightening of breath. The days were long, but their peace was always fragile. Water, stored in barrels for weeks, developed a foul taste. Rum was a comfort, sometimes a necessity, dulling the senses just enough to make ship life more bearable. But rum, too, had its cost. It frayed tempers, clouded judgment, and invited conflict. Still, for many, it was the only warmth they'd know. They rejected the laws of society only to create their own system of instability and violence. Pirates were not the free-spirited adventurers of legend, but rather desperate men and women, living in constant danger and always struggling to survive. Their lives were marked by brief moments of triumph, but these moments were always overshadowed by the hardships that came with life on the high seas. Even though they share in the spoils of a successful raid, their loyalty to one another is often fragile. Each morning began not with leisure, but with duty. Sailors rose with the sun, the light casting long shadows across weather-worn decks. The sea might be calm or rough, the skies clear or threatening, it mattered little. The work was constant. Sailors climbed the rigging to adjust sails, checked for leaks in the hull, and cleaned the deck with briny water and stiff brushes. The repetition was numbing, but necessary. There was no luxury of rest, for the ship demanded attention, and the sea offered no mercy to the unprepared. When the treasure runs out, or when a captain's leadership falters, mutiny can rise from within. The tension is ever present, simmering beneath the surface. And even the strongest and most respected pirate captains are not immune to the threat of betrayal from their own men. The pirates are always hungry, always exhausted, and their health is in constant decline. Yet they endure, because survival depends on it. A captain may command respect as long as the crew is successful, but their power is never secure. If a captain's decisions lead the crew into danger, or if they fail to deliver enough spoils, the crew will turn on them. Even Blackbeard, one of the most feared pirates in history, was eventually brought down by a well-coordinated assault from the British Navy, aided by betrayal within his own crew. No matter how successful or charismatic, the pirate captain's reign was always fragile, ultimately subject to the whims of the crew, whose loyalty was always in question. The prospect of riches, of freedom, of a life outside the bounds of society, is enough to keep them going if only for another day. The freedom they sought was never a permanent state. It was a fleeting illusion that could be shattered by a storm, a mutiny, or a battle with the Navy. And when the end came, as it always did, it was rarely a peaceful one. Pirates died violently, either in battle or execution, and their names, though remembered in myth and legend, were often reduced to nothing more than a symbol of the lawlessness they embraced. Their lives were not a quest for everlasting glory, but a desperate attempt to survive in a world where every moment was uncertain, every step taken on the edge of destruction. The pirate's life is a constant struggle, a fight for survival in a world where nothing is guaranteed and where danger is always just around the corner. For many, it is a life that ends in failure, death, or capture. But for others, it is a life that they would not trade for anything, because in the end, it is the only life they know. As the pirate ship drifts further into uncharted waters, the crew grows more restless. The sea, vast and infinite, holds both the promise of treasure and the constant threat of doom. The horizon stretches endlessly before them, an open world of opportunity and danger, yet it never offers the comfort of certainty. The treasure they plunder is quickly spent on food, repairs, and the upkeep of the ship. It is a brief escape from the constant struggle for survival, but it is never enough to offer true comfort or security. The pirates know that their luck is always running out, that the horizon they chase is always receding. Even when they seize a ship and take its riches, there is always the reality that the next battle, the next storm, could destroy everything they've fought for. And even when they return to port to resupply, the fleeting pleasures of their brief respite are always overshadowed by the knowledge that they are outlaws. Constantly on the run, the pirates have no permanent home, no place to settle. Every new port is a brief refuge, but it is never long before the need to flee takes hold again, propelling them forward into the unknown. For the crew, the ship becomes both sanctuary and prison. But the cost of survival is high. Even in the moments when they find success, the pirates' victories are bittersweet. Pirates live with the constant threat of betrayal hanging over them. The pirate captain's authority is always in question, and that insecurity is a heavy burden. Even as pirates fought for treasure and freedom, they knew that their lives were always on the line. In the end, the pirate's life was defined by paradoxes. The daily rhythm aboard a pirate ship was slow and unchanging, yet always tense. Meals were taken quickly, often in silence. The food was poor, hardtack crawling with weevils, salted meat nearly too tough to chew. The long hours were spent with tasks both physical and mental. Below deck, the conditions were worse. Dark, cramped, and damp, with barely enough room to sit upright. Occasionally, there was time for distraction. Dice games by lantern light, stories whispered of past raids and imagined riches, a tune played on a pipe or fiddled softly. In this way, a pirate's life was often defined by repetition. Each raid followed the same pattern: the excitement of the chase, the thrill of the attack, the division of treasure, and the fleeting moments of indulgence that followed. Yet after the initial rush of victory, the pirates returned to their life of hardship. The treasure was spent quickly, the ship was in need of repairs, and the crew once again turned their focus to survival. Every new raid offered the hope of something more, but that hope was often dashed as soon as the loot was gone. And the pirates found themselves in the same cycle of struggle. For many, piracy had been an escape away to break free from the rigid constraints of society. But that freedom came with a price. The sea, which had once represented freedom, had become a prison, and the promise of treasure had proven to be a fleeting illusion. Pirates were trapped in a cycle of survival, always fighting for their next meal, their next raid, and their next chance at freedom. Pirates must constantly be on the move, always looking for new opportunities, new ships to raid, new ways to stay one step ahead of their enemies. Even as they plunder and fight for their survival, they know that their enemies, the navies, the colonial powers, and rival pirates are always watching. There is no safety, no place to rest. The pirate ship is both a refuge and a trap, and for all the freedom it promises, it also demands everything from those who sail it. The pirate crew, for all its external unity, was an unstable entity. The lack of comfort, the constant exposure to danger, the absence of privacy, these things take their toll over time. It is the dream that drives them to keep fighting, to keep raiding, to keep surviving. But for most, this dream is never fully realized. Even the wealth that comes from a successful raid is often fleeting. The gold and silver that pirates acquire are quickly spent on necessities, food, supplies, repairs, and once the treasure is gone, the cycle begins again. Pirates never find true comfort. They live on the edge, always fighting for their next meal, their next opportunity, their next escape. Pirates live in a world where the only certainty is uncertainty. They live with the knowledge that at any moment, everything could change. A storm could destroy their ship, a battle could end in defeat, or a betrayal could leave them stranded without a way to escape. The pirate's life, though it may seem filled with adventure and excitement, is ultimately one of fear and anxiety. For most pirates, the adventure they sought was never fully realized. The promise of freedom, which had once felt like a beacon on the horizon, now seems more distant than ever. The sea is their world now, and they know no other way of life. For some, piracy is the only option available. Whether they were once sailors cast adrift, criminals running from the law, or outcasts rejected by society, piracy offers them a place where they can exist without the constraints of the world they left behind. It offers them a sense of freedom, freedom from the laws of society, freedom from the expectations placed on them. But this freedom is never without cost. The price of living outside the law is high, and for most pirates, it is paid with their health, their safety, and ultimately, their lives. Despite their best efforts, the pirates find themselves caught in the same cycle of violence, theft, and survival. The treasure they fought so hard to acquire never seems to last long enough, and with every raid, they risk their lives for what ultimately feels like a fleeting, temporary victory. The vast sea before them, once a symbol of endless possibilities, now feels like a vast, unending expanse of danger and isolation. Instead, they found themselves living on the edge, forever seeking freedom, but never truly escaping the dangers and hardships that defined their existence. Pirates might live outside the law, but in doing so, they also created their own set of rules, a set of rules that ensured their lives would be defined by struggle, uncertainty, and inevitable loss. Pirates came from all walks of life-escaped slaves, disenfranchised soldiers, former sailors, and criminals. A captain, no matter how respected or feared, could be overthrown if the crew became dissatisfied. Life aboard the ship is precarious, and even in the moments when they are not fighting or raiding, the tension is palpable. The crew knows that any mistake, any misstep, could lead to disaster. The threat of mutiny is ever present, and even the most respected captain can be overthrown if the crew grows dissatisfied. Trust is a fragile thing on a pirate ship. While the crew may bond over shared success, their loyalty is always tested by hunger, fear, and the uncertainty of their existence. Pirate crews are not built on long-term relationships. They're built on necessity, and when that necessity is gone, so too is the crew's unity. pirates had no real loyalty to their captain except in moments of success. Once the treasure ran out or the captain made an unpopular decision, their leadership was often in question. The pirate captain, while the nominal leader, was always walking a fine line. Their authority was tenuous, and their reign could end as swiftly as it began. Many of the most infamous pirate captains, such as Blackbeard or Charles Vane, were ultimately betrayed by their own men. They were bound not by loyalty, but by the shared need for survival. The constant danger, the relentless pursuit of treasure, and the ever-present fear of death wore on the body and mind. Many pirates turned to alcohol or other vices to cope with the constant strain of life at sea. The isolation of the pirate life, the absence of any true community or support system, made the emotional and psychological toll all the greater. Pirates were often forced to live without any sense of home, without any sense of peace or stability. For many, the idea of finding a safe harbor or retiring from piracy was a distant, unrealistic dream. They lived in close quarters, often with little privacy and even less comfort. They depended on one another to keep the ship afloat and to succeed in their raids. But the relationships between crew members were always fragile. The bonds that formed in the heat of battle or in the excitement of a successful raid were often broken as quickly as they were made. When the spoils ran out, when the crew had to face the harsh reality of life on the ship, tension would inevitably rise. The threat of mutiny was a constant in a pirate's life. Pirates, for all their bravado and defiance of authority, were not immune to the toll their lifestyle took. As the pirate ship continued its journey, the crew could not help but reflect on the choices that had led them to this point. In the end, the pirate's life was one of constant uncertainty, filled with brief moments of glory that were overshadowed by the harsh realities of the world they lived in. As the pirate ship sails deeper into uncharted waters, the crew feels a strange mix of hope and dread. The pirate crew, despite being united in their shared goal of survival, is always vulnerable. For the pirates, survival is never guaranteed. The sea is both a source of life and a relentless enemy. The constant state of tension affects more than just the physical survival of the crew. It wears on the mental and emotional health of the pirates. For many pirates, the hope of treasure and freedom is what keeps them going. Despite the hardships, many pirates continue because they have no other choice. And yet, despite it all, some found a strange pride in the life they led. It was not ease they sought, nor even riches, but a kind of belonging, a place outside the reach of kings and merchants, where no one bowed to a master, and each man was the maker of his own fate. The hardships were real, but so too was the freedom, however fleeting. For some, the pirate ship was the only home they'd ever known, the only place where their voice was heard and their strength valued. But as the days wore on, the sea began to feel endless. Each pirate was a survivor, and in the brutal world they inhabited, survival was often a solitary pursuit. Friendships were fleeting, and the idea of true camaraderie was often shattered by the harsh realities of their life. Trust was hard to come by, and every decision, no matter how small, was weighed with the knowledge that betrayal could be lurking just around the corner. Pirates lived on the edge, not just physically, but emotionally as well. They lived outside the law, free from the rules and structures of the land they had once known. This was a life of defiance, a rejection of the norms that governed other people's lives. In a world ruled by kings and merchants, pirates carved out their own existence. They were outlaws, living on their own terms, answering to no one but themselves. And yet this freedom was always fragile, always dependent on their ability to survive in a world that did not want them to exist. Every raid, every conflict was a test, not just of skill, but of loyalty. And in that loyalty there was always the seed of doubt. Pirates were free to take what they wanted, to live by their own rules. It was this freedom that kept them going, even when the world around them seemed to crumble. Pirates were nomads, with no fixed home to return to, no place where they could truly belong. The crew members came and went, often replaced by others who joined in search of a better life, only to be swept away by the same endless tide. The bonds that were formed on the ship, born out of necessity, were never as strong as those of kinship or friendship. The pirate crew was a temporary alliance held together by the shared need to survive, but always teetering on the brink of collapse. It was a life defined by rebellion, by the desire to be free. Even if that freedom meant living in constant fear, in constant uncertainty. The pirate's life was one of contradictions, freedom and peril, triumph and failure, loyalty and betrayal. The sails frayed, the hull groaned, and the faces of the crew grew weary, sunburnt, and lined with salt and fatigue. The days stretched on, one indistinguishable from the next, each filled with the same endless tasks. The same muted conversations, the same brief moments of celebration. For a while, the pirates had lived with the hope of a grand treasure, of finding freedom in the riches they plundered. But now, their existence felt more like a relentless Sokola struggle to maintain life in a world that offered no guarantees. The crew members shared in the struggle, and they shared in the fleeting moments of triumph. When they raided a ship and claimed its spoils, there was a brief sense of satisfaction of having fought and survived, but this was never lasting. The treasure was quickly consumed, used to repair the ship, buy supplies, or indulge in a rare luxury. There were no long-term comforts, no real respite. The pirates were always on the move, always looking for their next prize, their next escape. The dreams of treasure faded, replaced by simpler hopes: a dry bed, a warm meal, a safe shore. They were only as powerful as their crew allowed them to be. If the crew grew discontented, if the captain made a mistake or failed to deliver the wealth and adventure they promised, mutiny was always a real threat. The life of a pirate captain was not one of absolute power, but of constant negotiation, constant need to prove oneself. A captain had to balance the desires of the crew with the realities of their perilous existence. The captain's rule was fragile, and even the most respected could fall when their leadership was called into question. Some began to wonder if they'd ever see land again, or if the sea would take them as it had taken so many others. There was no rest, no home, and no sense of permanence. The crew might make landfall to resupply, but even then, they were never truly safe. They were hunted by navies, by rival pirates, and by the law. There was no true sanctuary for pirates. They were always on the run, always looking for their next hiding place, their next escape. In the end, the daily life of a pirate was not defined by gold or glory, but by endurance. It was a quiet, grinding struggle against the sea, the ship, and the self. The initial excitement of adventure and treasure had long since faded, replaced by the relentless grind of survival. There were no more dreams of gold and riches, only the stark reality of the sea. A harsh and unforgiving environment that demanded constant vigilance and sacrifice. It was the choice to keep going, day after punishing day, because there was no other choice. No promise of comfort, only the rhythm of waves, and the hope that tomorrow would not be worse than today. As the days turned into weeks, and the pirate ship continued its never-ending voyage across the endless horizon, the crew's morale began to fray at the edges. Every creak of the ship's timbers, every wave that crashed against the hull, was a reminder of how fragile their existence was. The pirates had no control over the sea. They could only hope for favorable winds and pray that a storm would not destroy them. The very thing that had promised them freedom, the vast ocean, had now become a prison, one that they could not escape. The bond between the pirates, though it existed, was a tenuous one. Despite their shared struggle, their loyalty was ever in question. Life aboard the pirate ship, for all its roughness, was still a world unto itself. The captain, despite their apparent authority, was never immune to the shifting tides of pirate life. Pirate ships were places of constant motion, always seeking, always raiding, always running. But despite the hardship, there was a strange form of freedom that only a pirate could understand. All the hardships of pirate life, the disease, the hunger, the constant danger, there was a sense of autonomy, a sense of power that came from living outside society. As the pirate ship drifted through the open sea, the crew began to grow numb to the constant rhythm of survival. The sea, once a symbol of possibility, now felt like an eternal expanse of isolation. Even in the moments of respite, when the ship anchored in a hidden cove or made landfall to resupply, there was no peace to be found. Pirates were always on edge, always alert for the possibility of danger. The authorities were never far behind, and rival pirate crews were always a threat. The captain could issue commands, but the crew had the final say. Their votes determined the course of action, and their loyalty was earned only as long as the captain's leadership remained effective. The endless danger, the constant uncertainty, the isolation, it all began to wear on them. The pirates who had once dreamed of riches and glory were now more concerned with surviving the day, with staying alive long enough to see another sunset. The horizon stretched ahead, always distant, always just out of reach. Every horizon promised new opportunities, new prizes to capture, new territories to raid, but it also promised more of the same. The leader of the crew, the one who steered the ship toward its next destination, the one who made the decisions that could mean the difference between success and failure. But even the captain was not immune to the relentless pressures of pirate life. The captain's authority was never certain, always hanging by a thread. They had no permanent home to return to, no place where they could rest and forget the dangers of the sea. The horizon remained an elusive goal, always just beyond reach. The sea, for all its dangers, was their only constant, their only companion. It gave them freedom, but it also took everything else. Yet they kept sailing, knowing that they would never truly escape the chase. The life of a pirate was a paradox: freedom and danger, success and failure, unity and betrayal. And it was a life that ended as unpredictably as it began, with no guarantee of a happy ending, no promise of peace. The crew could easily overthrow their leader if they grew dissatisfied, or if the captain made a mistake. In many ways, the captain was the most vulnerable member of the crew, always at risk of losing control, always having to prove their worth to the men they led. Even the most feared pirate captains, like Blackbeard or Captain Kidd, were not invincible. Their reigns were marked by violence, betrayal, and the ever-present threat of mutiny. The endless pursuit of treasure, the fleeting satisfaction of a successful raid, and the constant battle for survival. The pirates knew they were in this together, and their survival depended on their ability to work as a unit. They shared in the spoils of a successful raid, but they also shared in the hardships of life at sea. They ate together, slept together, and fought together. The bond between them, though fragile, was one of necessity. Pirates didn't always trust each other, but they depended on each other to stay alive. Without that bond, without the crew, there would be no pirate ship. And yet, even in these moments of camaraderie, there was always the knowledge that this unity could break apart at any time. Pirates were outlaws, and outlaws were always on the edge, always living with the knowledge that their freedom came at a high cost. It was a life that offered freedom, yes, but only at the cost of everything else: comfort, security, and peace. The ship was their home, their refuge, and yet it was also a constant reminder of their fragility. No pirate ship could last forever. Ships rotted, sails tore, and planks splintered. The very vessel that carried them across the seas was always on the verge of breaking down. Just as their lives were always one misstep away from falling apart, the ship needed constant care, constant attention, and constant repair. It was a never-ending job, just like life itself. Some began to wonder if they would ever reach the end of their journey, if they would ever find a place where they could rest, where the sea no longer had control over their lives. But for most, that dream remained distant, a fantasy that could never be fully realized. As the pirates grew more desperate, the cracks in the crew's unity became more apparent. It would come through violence, illness, or betrayal, and that was as uncertain and uncontrollable as everything else in their lives. The pirate ship, once a symbol of freedom and rebellion, had become a symbol of their struggle. It was a place where dreams of treasure had long since faded, replaced by the harsh reality of survival. The pirates knew their time was running out, but they continued to sail, for there was nowhere else to go. The horizon might be empty, but they sailed toward it anyway, always searching, always hoping, but never truly free. In a world where every man's survival depended on the group, there was no room for weakness, no tolerance for indecision. The captain, too, was a man on the edge, vulnerable to the whims of the crew, forever at risk of losing their position and their life. The freedom they sought, the freedom from society's rules and constraints, had become a prison of its own. The pirate life was one of constant motion, but it was motion without purpose. No matter how many ships they captured, no matter how much treasure they stole, the pirates were always left wanting more. There was no end to the chase, no real reward for all their suffering. The life of a pirate was defined by its instability, by the uncertainty of what the next day would bring. And yet, for many pirates, this was all they knew. The sea was their home, the ship was their only family, and the quest for treasure was the only purpose they had left. The promise of wealth and freedom that had once lured so many to the pirate life now felt like a distant memory, tantalizing illusion that was as elusive as the horizon itself. The sea was their home, and the ship was their only refuge. The treasure they sought was always just out of reach, but the freedom they had gained by rejecting society's constraints kept them going. It was the only life they knew, the only life they had left. They lived for the thrill of the chase, for the hope of a big score, and for the promise that, if only for a moment, they could escape the grinding monotony of life ashore. Its place. It was only the harsh reality of their existence, the constant struggle to survive in a world where every day could be their last. The captain, too, felt the weight of this uncertainty. They had once led the crew with confidence. Their orders followed without question, their decisions final. But over time, the pirate captain's authority began to wane. The crew grew restless, their loyalty tested by the constant hardships and the absence of lasting success. The promise of treasure, once so compelling, had faded, and the captain's ability to inspire the crew became more difficult with each passing day. The threat of mutiny loomed, and even the most experienced pirate leaders knew that their time on the seas was limited. The captain's rule was never permanent. It was always dependent on the crew's satisfaction. Pirates might have lived outside the laws of society, but they were still bound by the harsh laws of the sea laws that could not be ignored. Despite the struggles, despite the uncertainty, the pirates continued to sail. They had nothing else to turn to. But as the years passed, many pirates began to question the price of this freedom. For the pirates, the end of the journey was inevitable. The pirate ship sailed on, its sails flapping in the wind, carrying its weary crew across the endless expanse of ocean. For many pirates, the sense of freedom had long since turned into a weight, a burden they carried with them every day. The captain, as always, was at the center of it all. And yet, despite all the dangers and uncertainties, there was a strange form of loyalty among the crew. The ship itself, battered and weathered by time, was a symbol of the pirates' existence. Unyielding, but always on the brink of collapse. Despite the hardships, the pirates sailed on. They had no choice but to continue, to keep moving, to search for the next prize, the next chance at freedom.